In this morning's readings, chapter 3 and 4, we read how Yahweh delivered his people across the flooded Yarden River on dry ground. Many explanations have been given or put forward in recent times as to how this impossibility happened. But when we consider the circumstances surrounding the event and look more closely at the words of chapter 3, we see Yahweh caused Israel to be in the right place at the right time. It is the first of three abnormal events that occur in this book. Now, these three abnormal occurrences in the book of Yehoshua include the crossing the Yarden on the dry ground, the collapse of the wall of Jericho at the sounding of the shofars, and the sun and the moon standing still while Yehoshua was battling for 24 hours. Each of these abnormal events have been the reason for many people in the modern world to pass Scripture off as myth and legend. So, did Yahweh cause those three events to occur as miracles? And if so, how do we define miracles? When we look at Wikipedia, it defines miracles in two different ways. Religious explanation is that the word miracle is usually used to describe any beneficial event that is physically impossible or impossible to confirm by nature. From a deistic perspective, the world defines miracles as a direct intervention by God into this world. From a naturalistic explanation, a miracle may be fake information, a fictitious story, rather than something that is truly happening. A miracle experience may be due to cognitive errors or psychological errors of the witness. So which explanation is correct? Each one of us must make a choice on this matter. It is an important matter because the choice we make will determine how we have, what our relationship with Yahweh is like, and how we will read the scriptural narrative. I believe there are basically three choices that we can make on this matter. The first choice is that Yahweh can do whatever he pleases. He can interfere with the natural laws of the world and the universe that God created. Second choice is that God can work with those laws and the forces of nature for the benefit of his people, Israel. The third choice, of course, is the whole narrative, particularly as it relates to these natural events in the book of Yehoshua, is all hyperbole and is designed to stimulate the imagination of the reader. But there is no connection with the real natural world. Or, put another way, it's nothing more than stories and myths. Now, the choice we make will affect how we read the book of Yehoshua and many other parts of the scriptures as well, including particularly the first few chapters of Genesis, where we see the creation story and the flood narrative, as we read this morning. My personal choice is the second. Yahweh works with the forces of nature for the benefit of his people, Israel. Now, having said that, let's go back to the Yarden River. The timing of the river crossing. In chapter 4, verse 19, it says, they came up to the river on the 10th day, came up out of the river on the 10th day of the first month. Now, that's the month of Aviv. That was exactly 5 days short of 40 years since their fathers had left Egypt. It was also exactly the same day of the year that Yeshua rode into Jerusalem on the donkey. Now, while Scripture makes no direct connection between those two events, I believe it is significant because before Israel marched to Jericho, they had to observe Pesach, which for them became an annual event as a remembrance of their departure from Egypt. But for us, as Talmudim of Yeshua, we not only remember that departure, but also the remembrance of Yeshua's sacrificial death and resurrection. So having determined the timing of chapter 3 of Yehoshua, it begins with Israel preparing to cross the Jordan. We're told that they camped at Shittim, which is across the river opposite Jericho. So as you can see, Shittim is actually just on the plains of Moab, just about there. They'd come right round the bottom of the Dead Sea, round the outside of Edom, and marched up through Ammon and Moab. Here they are on the plains of Moab, just north of the Dead Sea, and they're ready to cross over. There's Jericho. So they're quite close to the head of the Dead Sea. In verse 5, Yehoshua tells Israel to consecrate themselves in preparation for what is destined to occur that next day. They have to set themselves apart for Yahweh. Then in verse 7, Yahweh speaks directly to Yehoshua, saying, "Starting today, I will make you great in full view of all Israel, so that they will know that just as I was with Moshe, I will also be with you." And this is one of the few times that Yahweh actually spoke directly to Yehoshua. Normally, he had to consult through the Kohen Gadol. The abnormal event about which was to occur would be seen by all Israel as a reflection of what Yahweh had done through Moshe. It would strengthen their confidence in the leadership of Yehoshua. The narrative says the Ark for the Covenant went ahead of the rest of the community on this occasion. But normally, when they marched in the wilderness, 6 tribes went ahead, then the Ark of the Covenant, and then 6 more tribes behind. But that was the order in which they marched with Moshe through the wilderness. But this time was different. All Israel were told to stay 1,000 yards behind the ark, with the words in verse 4, "Don't come any closer." They were told to keep their distance, while at the same time observing what the Kohanim were doing. Yahweh said to Yehoshua in verse 8, "Order the Kohanim carrying the ark for the covenant as follows. When you come to the edge of the Jordan, you are to stop in the Jordan itself." Now bearing in mind it's in flood this time, so they put their toes into the water. As the Kohanim stepped into the water, then Yehoshua continued on in verse 13, "As soon as the Kohanim carrying the ark put the soles of their feet into the water of the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan will be cut off upstream and stand piled up like an embankment." Yehoshua was looking forward at that stage to what was about to occur. That is, when the Kohanim stepped into the river. But then in verse 15 through 17, the narrative suddenly reverses itself and looks back with hindsight as a post-event review of what had occurred when the crossing took place. In those verses we see, when those carrying the ark had come to the Jordan, and the Kohanim carrying the ark had waded into the water, for throughout the harvest season the Jordan overflows its banks. The water upstream stood piled up like an embankment for a great distance at Adam, the city next to Zartan, so that the water flowed downstream toward the Sea of Arava, that is the Dead Sea, was completely cut off. The people crossed right by Jericho. The Kohanim carrying the Ark of the Covenant stood fast on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan, while all Israel crossed on dry ground until the entire nation had finished crossing the Jordan. Now that's a narrative explaining what happened after the event. Now that certainly was an abnormal occurrence. However, when we look a little more closely, we see that the water was piled up as an embankment at a place called Adam, which is now known as Damia. Adam, or Damia, is located approximately between 30 and 40 kilometres north of Shittim. That's where Israel crossed. So it didn't pile up right alongside them. It was nearly twice the distance from here to Napier, away from them, where the actual damming up occurred. Adam, which is specifically mentioned by name, was the normal crossing point in ancient times. If you can put up the next slide for me. Thank you. Position where the road crossed the Yarden at Adam. It's likely the place where the patriarch Yaakov actually crossed the Yarden the night after his encounter with the angel on the banks of the Yabak River, after he was returning from his 20 years with Lavan. Now Adam, or Damia, is located about 2 kilometres south of where the Yabak joins the Yarden. It is also one of those few locations where there's an island in the middle of the river. As we can see here, there's the river coming down from the link up with the Yabak, just up here, comes down, and then it splits. That's the main channel, and then it splits around there like that and joins back up again. That's the ancient bridge. The Adam Bridge it's called, and that was the buttress of the bridge, and it was broken there and broken there, and a new one was put across. But this was broken in the 1967 war, so that the Jordanians couldn't get across. And they built, the Jordanians actually, to get to the West Bank later, built this Bailey Bridge on a new road. But the important thing is this split, this island in the middle. It's one of the only ones like that. So, at some stage in the history of the river, it carved out that second channel right at the location of the Adam Bridge, which may well have been the epicenter of an earthquake, which had caused a temporary damming of the river, which finally broke through and cut a second channel as a diversion of the river at that point. Go back to the other slide. Now, there is evidence in 1927, at that very place, there was an earthquake and a landslip, and it did block off the river at that point. So as we can see from this map, that they crossed over down here, close to Jericho. That's Gilgal. They came across the plain of Moab, at Shittim, up around here. They crossed over the river there, camped at Gilgal. Next week they'll go to Jericho. But way up here is where, somewhere up around this region, is where the Bridge of Adam was. So you can see it's quite a long distance from where they were actually crossing that the damming effect took place. Were these features at that one location just coincidence, or was it the hand of Yahweh working on behalf of his people? It would only take a matter of a few hours for the river to carve out that second channel, particularly while in flood. Just enough time for Israel downstream to walk through a dry riverbed. Then once the obstruction, of course, was eroded by the river, it returned back to its normal flow in 2 streams around that island, which had become a temporary obstruction. Now, does that explain the first of these 3 miracles that occur in the book of Yehoshua? In no way does it diminish the power of Yahweh. who has been using the forces of nature. It was an abnormal occurrence for the benefit of his people. We can see that miracles can use the forces of nature. And this is proven by what has occurred in 1927. So going back again to chapter 3, verses 9 to 11, before the crossing of the river, Yahushua reminds the people of Israel that they can trust Yahweh and be reassured that Yahweh will be with them. He will never fail them. And he is the one who's going to drive out those 7 nations ahead of them. So having experienced their crossing of the river on dry ground in the midst of that seasonal flood, Israel could have full confidence that Yahweh would clear away everything ahead of them, and they would take possession of the territory which had been promised to their forefathers. What the Yarden looks like now, because there's so much water taken out of it. From 1964, Israel developed what's known as the National Water Carrier, which is actually a pipe system and a channel which takes the water down the western coast, all the arable land on the west plains, and all the way down to feed Tel Aviv. And since that was in 1964 that began, so that diminished the flow of the Yarden immensely. And then again in 1994, the treaty with Jordan allows Jordan to take 50 million cubic meters of water from the river every year. But in the meantime, of course, Israel has started desalinating the seawater. So a lot of the actual water used in Tel Aviv now is produced by desalination, but the water from the Yarden is still used for irrigation. But it hardly ever floods. It's just a trickle, and that's just a muddy trickle as it is now. So that's changed completely from the ancient times. So moving on to chapter 4, before crossing the Yarden, Yahweh instructed Yahushua to appoint 12 men, one from each of the tribes, go ahead of the ark of Yahweh into the riverbed of the Yarden. The men were to carry a stone each from the middle of the riverbed while the Kohanim was still standing there. They were instructed to build a stone monument where Israel was camping at Gilgal, there on the plains just close to Jericho. They were told in verses 6 and 7, the monument will be a sign for you in the future when your children ask, what do these stones mean? You will be able to answer them, it is because the waters of the Yarden were cut off before the ark for the covenant of Yahweh. When it crossed the Yarden, the waters of the Yarden were cut off, and these stones are a reminder to the people of Israel forever. Then in verse 9, Yahushua said also to the 12 men, take 12 stones from the Yarden itself and place them where the feet of the Kohanim carrying the ark stood, right there in the middle of the Yarden. They are there to this day. Now, I don't know. Nobody's been down to find out. Maybe they are. But maybe one day, when the Mount of Olives splits in two and the water flows from under the altar, the Yarden may change its course. And those stones may be revealed. From that ancient time, it'll be a confirmation of what is written is true. We'll have to wait to see. As verse 10 and 11 says, the Kohen who were carrying the ark stood in the middle of the river while Israel hurried past. The urgency in verse 10 suggests that the blockage Yahweh had created upstream was temporary, and the wall of water, and it was like the wall of water that stood either side of Israel when they crossed the Red Sea. It only lasted as long as they needed it. So when the Kohanim carrying the ark ventured up out of the riverbed, as soon as they touched the surface or got to the ground, the solid ground again, the waters of the Yarden returned to its normal place, and it overflowed as it had been before. Now the urgency involves forces. The urgency suggested here forces us to ask a question. How many people actually crossed the Yarden that day? If you follow the regular belief that it was approximately 2.5 million people in Israel, along with their herds and their flocks, it would have taken far longer than a day to get that mob across the Yarden. So the whole idea of urgency becomes utterly meaningless. That's a question that's still unanswered, but it's for a discussion another time. But it puts the idea in our mind that 2.5 million people to cross in one day would be a physical impossibility. And it says it was done in urgency because the water only held up for just a short time. As we saw in 1927, when the landslide happened because of the earthquake, it only lasted about 21 hours, and then the water gushed back through again. So it's all these things add together. On that day, Yehoshua earned his place as the future leader. Just like Moshe before him, he was held in awe by the people of Israel for the rest of his life. Chapter 4 concludes with Yehoshua reminding the people that all they had experienced on that day would be a constant reminder to the future generations. All the peoples of the earth as well would understand that Yahweh is in full control. Hopefully, they will remember that Yahweh is controlling everything, both the heavens and the earth, everything that God created. Finally, after 40 years of Israel had entered the land. They had been promised to enter and inherit that land 470 years earlier, when it was given, the promise was given to Abraham. In spite of their errant ways, Yahweh never gave up on his people and the promise that he had made regarding the land. His people were now about to face the nations that they were to displace. But having crossed the river on dry ground, they had full confidence that Yahweh would lead them in and displace the nations ahead of them. They were confident that he would follow through with his promises. So we'll see more on that next week. But what about Eliyahu and the Yarden? As we read in 2 Kings chapter 2, Eliyahu and Elisha wanted to cross the Yarden, approximately the same place as Israel had crossed. Eliyahu, upon striking the river, the waters parted, and both crossed on dry land, just as Israel had done through the Dead Sea. The similarity is profound because on that occasion, the waters parted not 35 kilometers up the river, but this time the waters parted immediately either side of them, just like it had been in the Red Sea with Moshe. In verses 11 and 13 and 14, it says, "Suddenly, as they were walking along and talking, there appeared a fiery chariot with horses of fire. And it separated the two of them, one from the other. Eliyahu went up into heaven in a whirlwind." And then verse 13, "Then he, Elisha, picked up Eliyahu's cloak, which had fallen from him. Standing on the bank of the Yarden, he took the cloak that had fallen from Eliyahu, struck the water and said, 'Where is Yahweh, the God of Eliyahu?' But when he actually hit the water, it divided itself left and right, just as it had done, and Elisha crossed over." In this situation, the heavenly host were present with the fiery chariot of God. which appears to have caused the waters to part. Whereas Israel, when it crossed with Yehoshua, the waters were dammed up 35 kilometres further north. But both situations were abnormal events or miracles. Only God could perform such a miracle, and the timing was exact in each situation. Just as Moshe handed on the mantle to Yehoshua, so also Eliyahu passed the mantle on to Elisha. By parting the waters of the Yarden for both of them, Yahweh confirmed that Elisha was now the leader of the guild prophets, bearing in mind that 50 guild prophets from Jericho were there on the bank watching all this happen. Once again, we see that Elisha was their accepted leader. The mantle had been passed, and this was confirmation, yet again, that the mantle had been passed to a new one. So let's move on and look at Yochanan and the Yarden. Again, we see that Yochanan the immerser established himself in approximately the same crossing point, right there in front of Jericho. Now, while Yochanan had no need for the water to part, he engendered considerable interest through his ministry. Being at that point of the crossing, he encountered many people coming to the agricultural festivals, Pesach or Matzah, Shabbat and Sukkot. Right there at the crossing point, they had to pass him on the way to those festivals and the Moedim, as appointed by Yahweh. He had a captive audience. That's why he was so successful with his ministry. It was also the same place where Yeshua himself, coming from the Galilee, was immersed, as we're told in verse 13 of Matthew chapter 3. However, the unique feature of Yeshua's immersion was that is what we're told in verses 16 and 17. As soon as Yeshua had been immersed, he came up out of the water. At that moment, heaven opened up, and he saw the Spirit of God coming down upon him like a dove. And the voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, whom I love. I am well pleased with him." Those words spoken from heaven were heard by many, but the one who was most profoundly impacted by those words was the adversary, Satan himself, who realized that he was being put on notice. Yochanan spoke forth the words of truth about his generation and paved the way for Yeshua's ministry by crying out in verse 2, "Turn from your sins to God, for the kingdom of heaven is near." This was a similar message to that of Moshe towards his generation. It took them 40 years, and they still did not reach the goal that was ahead of them. They left Egypt, but they never got into the promised land. Also, Yeshua gave his generation 40 years in which to accept him as the Mashiach. But, as Stephen says in Acts chapter 7, verses 51 to 52, less than a year after the death and final ascension of Yeshua, he says, "Stiff-necked people with uncircumcised hearts and ears, you oppose the Ruach HaKodesh. You do the same thing as your fathers did. Which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? They killed those who told in advance about the coming of the Tzaddik," that's the righteous one. "And now you have become his betrayers and murderers. You who received Torah as having been delivered by angels, do not keep it." So because of their lack of awareness, that generation who witnessed the death and resurrection of Yeshua were themselves thrown out of the land, and they became the beginning of a 1900-year diaspora, because they were constantly stiff-necked towards Torah. So in conclusion, we see that all three generations, that of Yehoshua, Eliyahu, and Yochanan, all had encounters or experiences right there at that one place on the Yarden River. And it impacted profoundly on everyone who crossed on that dry ground or who were immersed in the river. It was a place of unique experience on all occasions. And each of the three generations, Yahweh showed his might and his power, and to whom he had appointed to be the leader. The mantle had passed from Moshe to Yehoshua. The mantle passed from Eliyahu to Elisha, and the mantle of mission passed from Yochanan to Yeshua himself. God even took the opportunity to immerse Yeshua and announce to the adversary that Yeshua had become the anointed one to whom all authority had been given. He also gave assurance through the acknowledgement of his son Yeshua that he would be the one who would awaken all mankind from a sleep of death. So next Shabbat, we will venture forth in the book of Yehoshua into chapter 5. There we will look at Israel preparing for that first Pesach across the river in Eretz Israel. And then in chapter 6, we'll look at the destruction of Jericho city. Shabbat Shalom.